You see, something's going to happen. Something wonderful.
My God, it's full of stars.
Welcome to the Occult Rejects. On this episode, you have myself and you got Liza joining me as a co-host in this episode, and we got a very special guest in a sense, is because it was wild how this man even came across to me. I have to thank I guess Dana. Thank you, Dana, for tagging me. I guess because she had known that I was looking into the Rotary Club with the Smiley Face Killers topic. She had known this guy Justin, who has the LDSabuse account on Twitter, which I highly suggest I go check out, was covering something with Mormons and Rotary. And she was like, oh, Nick's been talking about Mormons and he's been talking about Rotary, so this must be great for him. Tagged me in it, and I took a look at it, and I was like, oh, wow, this is wild. And he's got a bunch of stuff that he's kind of been covering and looking into, and I got him to come on the show. He's got a blog, too, that I highly suggest to go check out, and he is going to probably use that today to go off some of the stuff we're going to talk about. Before we get into it, I will let him introduce yourself, and if you want to give any background or anything. If not, you don't have to, but if you want, please at least let people know where they can find your blog or anything you want to promote, your Twitter or anything. So.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so my name is Justin, and I started the blog or the website, https://ldsabuse.info, about a year ago, actually, and with the intent of just studying the topic of mostly sexual and ritual abuse in the church. But as we got started, it just sort of branched out, and so it's become a much wider project, and I don't want to go too deep into that in the introduction, but we'll be looking at sort of one of these branches, which you mentioned, which I only came across last week, which is the connection between the Mormon Church and Rotary International, amongst other organizations. So,
yeah, that's some, yeah, that was kind of a weird connection to me, and I don't know, I don't, I think, I was telling Liza about this situation earlier, and me and her were there seems to be something with Masonry and Mormonism. I know Joseph Smith was a Mason, and the Rotary Club technically was started by Masons, or I think a few of them were Masons. I mean, some people will argue and say it's not Masonic. I think it's still a Masonic order in a sense, but it's just, it was interesting how, I've covered, Mormonism and Masonry going together. So they even use the beehives, beehives. And then it's just, weird now to see, something else that's kind of a flavor of Masonry has now got important Mormons in it. And I was like, this is just really weird. I guess to start it off, how did you even stumble upon this? Or maybe were you looking at something else and stepped into this? How did this happen?
Yeah, Rotary and Mormonism. It's another account on Twitter. It's Deny the Mark 2020, I think, talking about Racine, Wisconsin. And I had some interaction with Mike Ben Cyber on Twitter way back a year ago. And there was something going on between them. And this account said something about Mormons and Rotary, and it was something I'd never heard about. And I'm sort of a curious guy, so I thought I would check into it. And immediately I found a connection where a very prominent Mormon was the president of Rotary International. And where I found that was in a book that was written by a CIA agent named, Levi Virgil Harris, who was a Mormon CIA agent in South America. And this man had traveled out to South America to attend a Rotary International conference. And so it just piqued my interest. And I mean, it was one of the quickest veins, though, of as soon as I started looking into it, it was just so clear how deep Mormonism, and Mormons were into Rotary from the very, very beginning. And it's all in Rotary's official documentation. So it's a really interesting, sort of vein of research. So.
And then I guess, Now, did you want to pull up your site to, like, you know, I guess maybe get into some of the things you had? I wasn't sure when you wanted to pull that up or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think, like, so there really is a narrative here, right? And so I'd love to just sort of go through that, and then we can circle back on anything that you guys really want to dig in deeper, and we can just sort of take a look and talk some more about it, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So basically, you know, for those who don't, you know anything about Mormonism, you know, the first thing to understand is that when Joseph Smith, the founder of the religion, died, he didn't leave behind a succession plan. And so there were a lot of people who wanted to take power. And so I started my timeline here in 1860, which is a little bit, you know, further down than most people I think would in terms of the succession crisis. But the reason I do that is because what you'll see here is that approximately in 1860, those who felt that Joseph Smith, should have been succeeded by Joseph Smith III, established the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which later changed its name to the Community of Christ. So this was a really clean break between what people who aren't Mormon anymore will call the Brighamites and the Josephites. And it also just sort of neatly wraps up into about 160 years, right, which is 4 40-year generations. So when that schism happened, one of the major things that was going on is that the church leaders were really driving the church and themselves individually into really big financial problems. And so if you go and you look at George Q. Cannon, who was in the first presidency of the Mormon church at that time, and Heber J. Grant, who was an apostle in the church, you'll see in George Q. Cannon's diary for the 4th of December, 1891, where he says that he had quite a long conversation with Brother H.J. Grant concerning the subject which we had been discussing, the formation of a company to get loans of money on low interest from the East. So at this point in time, the church was really in financial trouble, and especially these leaders of the church. And so they were having these conversations about how they were going to bail themselves out. And of course, you know, where they looked was back east, because that's where all the moneyed interests were, right? You can sort of see how extreme the problem was, because in General Conference, which that's like twice a year, the Mormons get together, all of them together, and they have a big conference. And in that conference in 1898, George Q. Cannon, that same guy, was saying, the great bulk of the people, that is, the leading people, are in debt. The most prudent among us have got entangled. So Cannon had a son, Frank Cannon, who was a congressman and also knew a lot of people back east. And so he and his son and other church leaders devised this plan to finance the church by issuing bonds, right? And it says here, after Woodruff, which is referring to Wilford Woodruff, who was the president of the church. So the president of the church eagerly accepts the plan to finance the church by issuing bonds. And so once the president gives the green light there, Frank and George take the train to New York to go sell Eastern Capital on the proposition of investing in Mormonism as a business deal.
Why is it always got to involve New York, man?
Yeah, right. I mean, so I think this is really critical, because what people have to understand is that, you know, the sort of the correlated history of Mormonism is that they left Utah to get away from the world, right? They wanted to flee from Babylon, is how they would say it, in order to establish Zion. And yet here you are in 1896, they're in desperate financial need, and they immediately turn right back around and go back to New York. And I'm going to show you who they were talking to down here at the bottom, because I think this is extremely important for the conversation. So Frank says, it was interesting to watch the encounters between the Mormon prophet and some of the astutest of the nation's financiers, Frank related, as they interviewed Judge John F. Dillon and Winslow Pierce, attorneys for some of the Union Pacific interests. Also, Edward K. Harriman, which is a really important name because the Harrimans are Bush boys, right? So that whole political dynasty of the Bushes is tied in with the Harrimans and the Union Pacific. George J. Gould and members of the firm, and I don't know how to say this, so you'll have to forgive me, but it's Kuhn, Loeb, and Company. Now, I don't know how much time we have, but if we want to circle back, we can look at who Kuhn, Loeb, and Company's clients were. But the thing to know here is that Kuhn, Loeb and Company ends up being Lehman Brothers, which ends up being bought by American Express and so on and so forth. So they were one of the most influential investment banks at this time.
You know
right?
what's really interesting is that Christopher Loeb, from the whole Gilgo Beach situation, you probably may not even know who he is. Not too many people will even really know his situation anyway with Gilgo Beach, but he's got the same last name, and he was like trying to show me. I mean, he did pretty good job at it, like sending me stuff. How that last name does go kind of back to like some pretty interesting, prominent people.
Yeah. Well, there's another really interesting name tied to that, which is Schiff, right? Which you might recognize.
Oh, Adam Schiff.
Oh yes, yeah.
Yeah. So that he's
Schiff
like Schiff was the one who actually ended up running Kuhn and Loeb. So sorry, Lisa, I didn't mean to talk over you.
No, not at all. The attorneys, Pierce and Dillon, that they were for the Union Pacific, and that ties into Mormonism. Is that anything related to Independence, Missouri, where Mormons were initially located?
Yeah, I don't know where these connections to these Union Pacific interests really started. But what I can tell you is it's
started in Missouri, right?
I actually don't know the answer to that. But what I know is that Union Pacific and Mormonism are tied together at the hip. So, let me just give you a really quick example. So, Dallin H. Oaks, who's going to be the next prophet of the Mormon Church, sat on the board of Union Pacific. Brigham Young sat on the board of Union Pacific.
Yes.
I'm trying to think who else. I mean, there's there's multiple. I want to say it's the Marriotts, but I might be wrong about that. So, but I mean, there's multiple prominent Mormon men tied to these railroad interests. Which, of course, when you're tied into the railroad, you're tied into the politics of the railroad, right?
Well, the railroad controls a lot. I mean, Union Pacific, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, started in Kansas City, Missouri, off of the back of the cattle drives, because Kansas City, Missouri was the center hub for cattle drives back in the early 1800s. And then you have the railroad coming out, but then you also have Independence, Missouri, kind of as an offshoot of Kansas City. And I believe that is one of the hubs for Mormons. They even have a better genealogy place in Independence, Missouri that rivals that of the one of the Mormon. And that's how I saw the connection with Mormonism, Union Pacific, and Independence, Missouri. But that's why I was asking about that.
Yeah. So Independence is just a little bit before where this timeline starts. And so I haven't driven quite that far back in my research. But like now that you've sort of thrown that out, it's certainly going to have to be something I have to go look at, right? So because I just can't stop myself. So
Awesome. I love it.
But yeah.
Oh, real quick before we let you continue, I just did want to ask: is it Missouri that they consider the Mormons consider actually the Zion or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that Independence area and Adirondack Amen and Liberty is where a lot of really important historical events in the church took place. And so the church, sort of the mainstream, church belief is that eventually everybody's going to wander back that direction, and that's where the New Jerusalem will be built. And so it's a major part of both church history and sort of their destiny, to the believers, for sure.
That's interesting. You think if we just, if we all just move over to that area and the world takes a shit, we'll all be okay?
Cheap real estate out there, I hear.
Well, not even. It's like maybe some of these weird, like I don't want to necessarily call it a cult, but like maybe like one of these weird things, like maybe they're onto something, and like maybe they're actually picking a safe spot. I don't know.
Well, it's beautiful. I'll tell you, like I live in Tennessee, and when I want to get away and just go away with myself and just camp, like Missouri is the place to escape to, and it's gorgeous out there. And so, yeah, it's a great part of the country for sure.
Especially the Ozarks are nice.
Yeah. Arkansas and Missouri. It's a beautiful part of the country. So you can sort of see like when Joseph Smith landed there, right? And, like Garden of Eden, sure, why not, right? I mean, it really is beautiful, right? And so, but yeah, so there's, but major apocalyptic events predicted, for that area, that it needs to be cleansed before the Mormons can return back there and sort of build this new Jerusalem that they believe will sort of mirror the Jerusalem in the Middle East and so on and so forth. So a lot of theology and
they definitely
doctrine around that stuff.
They definitely try to cleanse it and clean it up over there now. Fucking tanks and bulldozers together.
Yep. So anyway, you can see sort of this need, and you can see where they turn. And so I mean, I don't think it takes too much imagination to figure out where this sort of heads, right? So these financiers are willing to take on the Mormon church sort of as an investment. And really what they're doing is they're buying the industriousness of the Mormons, right? Like you talk about the beehive, I think, and that may have been before we started recording, but like, you know, Mormons are known as this industrious people who turn the desert into a rose. And so I think these financiers look at it and say, yeah, like, we're certainly happy to bail you out if we can profit off the hard work of the people that you lead, right? And so like in a very loose sense, and maybe not even in a very loose sense, like I would sort of suggest that the Mormon leaders who were in debt and really desperate almost sold their people into slavery, right? To these Union Pacific interests and Harriman and Kuhn and Loeb, and then eventually Rotary International, which ties in, as we're going to see really soon, to the United Nations and so on and so forth, right? But it's all pretty normal human history. Like, you know, people who are broke do desperate things, and the Mormon leaders were broke. And it looks like they may have done something a little bit desperate that led to some pretty nasty consequences, right? So my next little spot here on the timeline, I just called it Bohemian Men Do Bohemian Things, right? So when you think of Mormons, the last thing you're supposed to be thinking of is Bohemians, because they're supposed to be these straight-laced, you know, conservative men who wear suits and ties. But what you see is as soon as they start getting this money flowing in is you get Wilford Woodruff out at the Bohemian Club, right? Now, the Bohemian Club is not the same as the Bohemian Grove. And so people need to be really careful about what they sort of, you know, draw, what inferences they draw from this. But what we can see is that on August 27th, 1898, which was right before Wilford Woodruff's death, he was out at the Bohemian Club, and he was the oldest man there, he says, and he gave a speech. So clearly they had bought their way to access some of the more exclusive, you know, occult organizations in the nation at this point, right? And this had already been going on. You can see it in the newspapers where Salt Lake City is fascinated with Yale and Skull and Bones, which we're going to talk more about. But seems to me to be the place where they've gotten rid of polygamy, and the financiers are ready to dump money into this Mormonism enterprise. And now you're going to start seeing Mormons become prominent outside of Utah, and especially back in Washington, D.C. So, you know, the major person that you're going to hear about is Reed Smoot. And so I don't know if you guys know this story. I'll try to keep it short. But Reed Smoot was elected. Yeah, so if you look at sort of once the money starts flowing in, you know, as most of us know in 2024, a lot of those congressional seats and senatorial seats are really kind of up for sale, right? And like once the money starts flowing in, you start seeing Mormons get access to sort of these higher forms of government. And the first person that you really hear about is Reed Smoot. And there's a bunch of hearings where they pull in everybody all the way up to the Mormon prophet, where he says, look, I'm not really that kind of prophet, sort of a thing. And eventually, though, he's able to take his seat. And once he takes his seat, he starts pulling a group of Mormons back east from Utah into swamp, right, over in Washington, D.C. And you start seeing an entirely new sort of subculture out in Washington, D.C. of Mormons that are really into this occult, secret societies and intelligence agencies and so on and so forth. So probably the prime example of that, like right around that time, is that over at the University of Utah, you see Yale create a chapter of Skull and Bones there at the university. And I've had this fight about 1.5 million times. And so I'm hoping this video can just put it to bed forever. Because if you go to the Utonian, which is the University of Utah yearbook, what you'll see is that they say it right out loud, right? And I can try to blow this. It's not a great quality picture, but it says right here, Skull and Bones was founded at Yale University in whatever year that is, 1832, maybe, I don't know, 18, whatever that is. And on May 18th, 1909, 11 men of the junior class of the University of Utah became charter members of the society at this school. So you'll get people like, well, I don't want to say his name because I feel bad for him, but it's one of the Bennetts. You know, you had the senators Bennett from Utah, and one of their, you know, posterity will come on and say, you know, quit being mean to my grandfather and my dad, because it was just an academic honor society, right? But I mean, the historical record is really clear that Yale reached out to Utah and they established a chapter of Skull and Bones right there at the University of Utah, right? And so within a couple years, you see Harding, who was a Skull and Bones member, right? And he makes a visit out to Utah where these University of Utah students give Harding a, am I saying that right? Is it Harding? No, William Howard Taft. I apologize. Okay. William Howard Taft is the Skull and Bones president, right? His father, Alfonso Taft, was one of the originators of Skull and Bones at Yale. And so when Taft comes out to the University of Utah, the University of Utah students give him 9 Yale cheers. And Taft recognizes that and says, I noticed you gave 9 Yale cheers. I'm glad to know you know that I'm a Yale man. I thank you for the courtesy, right? And so you can just sort of see this building, right? And I sort of think I was a Mormon for a long time. I was kicked out of the church in January. And so like I come from sort of this, like we always talk about like gardening, right, in the Mormon church. And I really think about these financiers sort of planting their garden at the University of Utah. And then you can just sort of watch as it matures and grows, right? So one thing I forgot to point out is that if you don't know who this guy is up here, everybody should really go look up. And I don't know how to say his name properly, so I'll offend him probably. I don't know if it's Gordon Gee or Gordon G, but he was a university president at many, many universities in the United States from the time after he was in Skull and Bones. But you're going to find a ton of really prominent men who go through that Skull and Bones sort of feeder system there at the University of Utah, and then are farmed out into positions of influence and gain in business, in law, and then of course in the church, which we're going to get to here pretty soon. Wow. So one of the important things that I think that most people don't know is that it was actually the future Utah governor, Herbert Ma, that was selecting Skull and Bones members there at the University of Utah. He was a dean at the University of Utah and was in charge of the debate club. And so you can see here from a newspaper article where it talks about how Herbert B. Ma is going to choose the candidates from the applications received. So from the very, very beginning, you've got very powerful people choosing out the people that they want to be very, very powerful in future generations, if that makes sense, right? And then, of course, we have our fun little picture because, you know, people think that in Utah nobody does anything, you know, offensive or crazy, but we've got our guy in blackface. It says Little Snow Black. We've got our cross-dresser, and I don't know who this guy is over here. I don't know if that's like a ninja or whatever, but the thing to remember here is that it ends up that the Mormon prophet is a member of Skull and Bones, right? And he's not going to get away joining this club without doing something along these lines, right? And so I think people just need to keep in mind that these secret societies, at least in my opinion, are really built on relationships of mutual shame, right? Like you paddle each other and you do stupid things. And then, of course, at Yale Skull and Bones, there's terrible stories about initiation rites that I won't get into too much. But really, these relationships are built on the ability to embarrass each other, right? Because you've done shameful things with each other. And so it's really interesting to see this group of Mormons flow through Skull and Bones at the University of Utah, including apostles and prophets of the Mormon church, right? I'm going to stop there for just one second and let you guys ask any questions if you want, because this next little piece, it sort of moves away from the Skull and Bones and into the Rotary connection. Did you guys have any questions about anything on sort of these last few data points?
The owl and key secrecy, isn't that also a mirror of another one at Yale?
Yes. My understanding, just based on the literature that I've read, is that Skull and Bones is your junior year. And then if you're in Skull and Bones, you automatically become a member of Owl and Key, right? Mm-hmm. And so the way that I look at this is sort of like you've got your sort of normal fraternity system that you have at every university. And I sort of think about that as like the minor leagues, right? And I'll often have people say, well, look, Justin, like my dad was Sigma Chi, or my grandpa was, you know, Pi Kappa Alpha, and he was a great guy. To which I reply, well, yeah, like 90-something% of people who join fraternities really just want free beer and, you know, company at night and, you know, whatever else it is that you get. And then, of course, the networking for your career, right? And so I really think of that as sort of like the minor league system for these sort of occult secret societies. And then if you sort of are willing to continue, like, they're just going to test you, right? And they're going to ask you to do something else. And as you continue to show that you're willing to do what they ask you to do, you're going to get bumped up into something like a Skull and Bones, which then throws you into Owl and Key your senior year. And then you're going to find yourself a nice cush job out of college. And so life is just a little bit easier that way, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. One thing.
Yeah, it's Scroll and Key. Sorry, Scroll and Key, the one from Yale.
Yes, I was just going to say this.
And they all have their own names, right? So at University of Utah, you can see right here, it is Allen Key at the University of Utah, but you're right. At Yale, it's a different name.
You know what I've wondered about, real quick? They also have Book and Snake over at Yale. And I've wondered if there's like some kind of like connection with the other one and this one. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like the way the words are playing, I could see maybe all of them like kind of being connected in a sense.
Yeah, so let me tell you how it worked at the University of Utah, because I don't know anything about that specific one that you're talking about, but let me sort of just tell you what the data shows. So, you know, in my career, like I work with data all day long, and so I was able to go through all the Utonian yearbooks, and we just sort of tore out all the pages that showed Skull and Bones and all the fraternity members. And when we ran the data, what you can see for the, let's see, it's got to be about 60-something years of data that we have, is that it's very clear that there was a power-sharing agreement between Sigma Chi and Pi Kappa Alpha up at the University of Utah, where each of them would get about 50% of Skull and Bones initiates every year, right? And then you sort of had your stragglers with these other fraternities, and they would sort of get the slim pickings that were left over, the breadcrumbs that were left over is a better way of saying that. Or, you know, and then they really liked to pick out people like the best athlete on campus, right? And so that would be somebody that they would also pull in to Skull and Bones or something like that. But they all so, and you have to remember, you brought up Masonry earlier, right? Every fraternity in the United States is based on Freemasonry, right? That's a very well-established fact in the literature as well, right? And so, like, while they have their rivalries, right, in a larger sense, they're all playing for the same team. And you see this very clearly in the Mormon church, where you'll have a guy go in Sigma Chi and he'll have a friend who's in Pi Kappa Alpha while they're in college, but then they'll end up working for the same government institution after they go through Skull and Bones, and then they'll end up in church callings together. And so, I mean, the thing that they all have in common is that they're just hiding things, right? Which is why they're occult secret societies, right? They have their secret handshakes, they have their secret oaths, their death oaths, but on a certain level, they're going to work together in order to accomplish sort of the larger, what I would consider Masonic purposes, right?
I think very few people there are actually really of like a deep understanding of the occult and magic, and are really kind of either like being taken advantage of, or they're just kind of like an everyday person, just an everyday, or they're kind of like street thugs.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, like, and it's a beautiful system, right? It's like genius, because you put together a bunch of organizations in the name of service to humankind, and then you sort of like started off by humiliating each other, and then you can just sort of start cranking up those experiences to see who's going to be willing to compromise their integrity more and more, right? And so, like, I mean, I give them all the credit in the world. Like, it's really genius the way that it's all set up, right? And so, and what it ends up, you end up having a ton of conversations with people saying, like, look, most of the people in these organizations are good people, and you have to acknowledge that that's true. What people aren't willing to look at or dig deeper on is, well, what about those people that you continue to press to do more and more, immoral, however you want to say that, shameful things, and they continue to do it, and you just pluck those people out, and then you put them into the positions where they can really make a difference in terms of your goals and your strategy of what you want to accomplish in the world, right? Which is where Rotary really ties into this, which it was really amazing last week when this came up, because it really does sort of tie in this sort of like one world government, United Nations sort of overall goal, right? And so, like, if you want me to, like, we can move on, because that's actually the very next thing, and it really gets extremely interesting here. And I would say 99% of Mormons have no idea that this is what happened in their history, right?
Let's go.
So what you got here is this guy, his name is Marion, and again, I'm just terrible with names, but it's like Marion Clavar Nelson, right? And so Marion is the father of Russell Marion Nelson, who is the current prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and president of the Corporation Soul, also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Oh, and I can see I have a spelling mistake, so bad on me. But so sorry about that. Marion Nelson was not really active in the church. while Russell was growing up. But what he was is extremely active in the community. And people can go and just find his obituary, and it's you know, very clear that he was extremely influential. And it just so happens that Marion Clavar Nelson, or Claver Nelson, became the president of the Salt Lake City Rotary Club in 1943, right? Now, 1943, of course, is leading up to the war. And when you go through the newspaper archives, what you can see is that Marion basically takes the Rotary Club and he's just organizing all the wartime efforts through the Rotary International organization in Salt Lake City. And he's doing it along with a guy by the name of Wallace F. Bennett, right? Who was Skull and Bones and senator there in Utah. So I don't want to go too deep in this, so stop me if I start rambling, but there's this really weird thing where you've got Russell Marion Nelson, who's clearly an extremely bright man. He was a heart surgeon, speaks multiple languages. So there's no doubt that he was extremely bright, but he started at the University of Utah in 1941, and you can't really find hide or hair of him all that much in the record. But as soon as his dad becomes the Salt Lake City Rotary International president, Russell M. Nelson becomes the big man on campus, and he joins Sigma Chi and then gets bumped up into Skull and Bones, and then joins the Navy, right? And as a doctor, and just sort of out of nowhere becomes this incredible rising star there at the University of Utah. And that really didn't make any sense to me until about last week when this whole Rotary thing came up, because what it seems to me that, and this is speculation at this point, but I think it's fairly sound, is that you have Marion Nelson working with Wallace F. Bennett, and their two boys are the same age. So Russell Marion Nelson and I think it's Wallace G. Bennett went to high school together at East High School. And so I think what you end up seeing is Marion saying, hey, could you help my son out a little bit, right? He's like in the music fraternity. He's like a pep boy, right? Like, and he's like singing, but what you see is him plucked out and then put into these positions of being like he must be in the 1945 Utonian 15 times his picture, right? So he goes from sort of zero to hero very, very quickly. And that didn't really make sense until we realized that Marion Nelson was an influential person in the community, particularly in Rotary International, which we then learned that Rotary International is, like, in their own literature, they brag a ton about being key to the creation of the United Nations. And I have a link here that if we wanted to look at it, you know, this article right here is where they just basically come out and say, look, we are one of the major reasons that United Nations came into existence. And it was through this Dumbarton Conference, right? That was in August through October of 1944, right at the same time that Nelson was elected as that president of the Salt Lake City Rotary International Club. So for me, at least, this puts things like into a very neat sort of puzzle, and everything really fits together, right? So if we go back, if we just sort of recap, you have a bunch of church leaders who've gotten themselves in a ton of financial trouble. So they go to the financiers in the East who say, sure, we'll help you out. We'll give you some loans. And of course, anytime somebody gives you money, there's things attached to it, right? So there's also privileges that come along with that. And so there's sort of this new Mormon aristocracy born when the money starts flowing in. And that's going to be your Cannons, it's going to be your Smoots, it's going to be your Nelsons, it's going to be your Winders, it's going to be your Claytons, it's going to be your Oaks. It's just sort of all the names. Oh, of course, Marriott's, it's going to be your Eccles. And so there just sort of creates this stratification inside the Mormon church where there's now an aristocracy, and they sort of all float out towards Washington, D.C., right? Now, this is a book that I literally got just 2 days ago. And so I haven't had a chance to sort of, I was going to digitize it, but it has copyright on it. And so I'm not sure it's allowed, but I will be taking pictures of it. And this is really sort of the history of this aristocracy inside of the Mormon church. And you can really watch and see how they form sort of their own subculture as this Mormon aristocracy. And they really see themselves as co-equals with the Utah church in a lot of ways. You can even find organization charts where a committee that I'm going to talk about here really soon you'll see it has the first presidency of the church at the top on the organization chart. Then it has the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. But right next to that Quorum of the 12 Apostles is what's called the Special Affairs Committee. And that Special Affairs Committee was largely run out of Washington, D.C. So before we sort of go into Special Affairs Committee, it's really important to understand that out in Utah, you've got a group that just continues to stay and sort of guard the home front, right? And they create a community which ironically is called Mount Olympus, right? So Mount Olympus, of course, is the home of the gods in Greek mythology. And so you get a bunch of these fraternity guys from the University of Utah on what they call the East Bench out there in Utah, which sort of runs Bountiful, Salt Lake, and down a little bit further south. But they create their own neighborhood called Mount Olympus. And so they're sort of these cosplay Christians who have been doing fraternity things while also pretending to be Mormons, and maybe not pretending, that's probably not fair to say. Like, I think they're genuine and sincere in like what they're doing, but like they just can't help themselves. And they create this community called Mount Olympus where the gods of Mormonism are going to live, you know, and something really terrible happens out there in the 1960s. And a woman who goes by the name of April Daniels, that's a pseudonym, wrote a book about this in the 1980s where she talks about the abuse that occurred out there in Mount Olympus in the 1960s. And the book is called Paper Dolls and Cowboy Boots. I would highly recommend that everybody interested in, you know, sort of abuse in the LDS church read it. It's sort of it's the book that everybody talks about, right? Because it has to do with sort of these East Benchers, and it's really prominent families like we're going to see here coming up really soon. So what happens in this sexual abuse situation is that it gets covered up, right? Which the LDS church is out there and they say, we're the gold standard of LDS, of abuse response and prevention and all this. But when you dig into it, I mean, they're really the worst, right? They just cover up scandal after scandal after scandal. And we're going to look at a couple really important ones here in the next few minutes. And so at this time, we know that the church is working with the CIA because the Bennett family is involved in Watergate, right, through public relations and that kind of thing. And so when that falls apart, what you see is that at the end of sort of the Bennett's run with the CIA, you see the church spin up sort of its own intelligence unit. And Gordon B. Hinckley is in charge of both sort of the propaganda arm of the church, which is all the media, and he's also in charge of the intelligence gathering operations, which I link to on my blog if people want to go to that. And so they create this committee called the Special Affairs Committee. And the Special Affairs Committee becomes sort of this hydra of bureaucratic committees that gets spun up during the era of Gordon B. Hinckley's leadership in the church and like leading up to that, because he was prophet of the church for quite a while. But even before that, he was running the church because the Mormon prophet was really sick and not able to sort of discharge his duties. So this Special Affairs Committee is really something that, I mean, we could do multiple shows just on the Special Affairs Committee. But if you just sort of think about it as the church's own internal interface with the military industrial complex, and specifically like the CIA and the FBI, that's probably the easiest way to think about it. And you've got guys like Ezra Taft Benson, who was in Washington, D.C., and then became an apostle of the church and prophet, having deep correspondence with J. Edgar Hoover. And then you run into Spencer W. Kimball, who was a Mormon prophet, who, this is actually a really funny story. So they released Spencer W. Kimball's journal last year. And I was like really in the thick of my research. And so I was going through page by page. And there was another person who was sort of following along, who was also going through page by page. And when we got done, he sent me his file, and I looked at my file, and they had a different number of pages in them. And so, of course, as a data guy, that just drives you crazy. And so I had to find the missing page. And when I found the missing page, here's what I found. On June 8th, 1977, Spencer W. Kimball excused himself from a meeting while at like a church meeting, and he met with Muhammad Khashoggi from Saudi Arabia and members of his family who were there for the dedication of the new International Center that was being erected out west of the Salt Lake City airport. So what happened here is that they released that journal, and then somebody must have been going through it and realized that they had revealed that President Kimball was meeting with CIA assets in 1977 and pulled that page out of the journal. So if you were to try to go find this page in the journal right now in the church's official archives, you wouldn't be able to find this page. But because this other guy was screenshotting everything while we were doing the research, we caught them in the act of removing this from Spencer W. Kimball's journal last year, right? So, like, kind of just a lucky break there, right? What the church didn't know is that we also were looking at a woman on that special affairs committee by the name of Beverly Bruff Campbell. And Beverly Bruff Campbell, again, could have her own episode or 2 episodes if you wanted. But just the way to think about her is that in her own memoirs, she calls herself the 13th apostle. And so she's working very, very closely with the leadership of the church due to this position on the special affairs committee that she has. And in 1977, Beverly Bruff Campbell is in Virginia using Saudi Arabian investor money to try to locate and buy land in Virginia, which of course is CIA country, right? So, I mean, it's just fairly clear that as the church continues to deepen their ties with the CIA, that they're literally having their prophets work with known CIA assets, right? The Khashoggis are probably the best known CIA asset in the Middle East, right? And so you can see these deep, deep ties being formed between the church and the military-industrial complex, right? So one of the major things that we found here pretty early on is that if you go to the CIA FOIA reading room, there's a document from 1984 that I'm going to blow up here. And you can see it's marked as secret. And in 1984, Office of Personnel Representatives traveled to Brigham Young University, which is the church's university, to recruit and meet with senior officials of the Mormon Church to discuss agency recruitment of church members. The church indicated its endorsement of the agency's mission and its elders' plan to meet and address any concerns about our recruiting effort and its possible undercutting of the church's image. And what you can see here is that the leaders of the church understood that what they were doing would undercut the image of the church, and yet they went ahead and did it anyway. And then as I dug deeper and deeper into the CIA's mission, I became more and more concerned because I bet you guys can tell me what the CIA's mission is, right? It's all about paranormal and occult activity and controlling people's minds and so on and so forth. So the fact that the leaders of the church were willing to endorse that mission, knowing that what they were doing would undercut the church's image because what the church's mission is supposed to be, was really deeply troubling, and was one of the things that I think eventually sort of led me to getting excommunicated from the church because I wasn't willing to let go of my concerns there. So I'm going to stop there again because I think this is a good sort of break in the chronology. Any questions about this sort of LDS, Mormon, CIA, military-industrial complex?
I have a question.
Yeah.
The timeline of 1977, the fact that they met with Khashoggi, the fact that LDS was now present in Central and South America brings Iran-Contra all into play.
Yeah, great question. And I did not put this on here, and I probably need to add it in after the show because so one of the major things that people need to understand is that 1977 is obviously a little bit before Reagan. But in 1980, Ronald Reagan gets elected, and his number 3 guy is Dick Werthland. And Dick Werthland is a Washington, D.C. Mormon, one of these sort of, that red book that I showed you. He's out there in Washington, D.C., and he's extremely powerful in that Reagan administration. And Dick Werthland is related to a Mormon apostle, Richard B. Werthland, and also Gordon Bittner Hinckley, who was an apostle and then eventually the prophet. They're all cousins. And so this Mormon aristocracy they're all related to each other, right? Like, just like European royalty, like intermarries, and I mean, maybe not at the same level, but like it is an aristocracy, right? And so you get, in 1980, you get Dick Werthland up there in Ronald Reagan's ear, and there's certainly, like, every major scandal that you can think of, Lisa, like Watergate, you have D. Todd Christofferson is one of the lawyers there, and you have the Bennetts being, using public relations firm, the Mullins public relations firm, to run, different things. Like, but I mean, the Robert Kennedy assassination, if you look that up, the bodyguard of Kennedy was a Mormon, right? So like everywhere you find one of these sort of major conspiracy theories, you're going to find within 1 degree of separation a prominent Mormon aristocratic family involved in that situation. And so, yeah, certainly Iran-Contra and anything going on during Reagan and Bush's administrations, even Trump, though. So Trump's national security advisor was Robert C. O'Brien, his last national security advisor. And this is not on the timeline either, but what I found is that Robert C. O'Brien, you can find an OIG report filed by one of the Vindman brothers, not the one that most people know, but the one that was like in the Army. He's an Army lawyer. And he filed an OIG report against Robert C. O'Brien, who was a Mormon that was Trump's national security advisor, because O'Brien was visiting Brigham Young University in September through November of whatever year it was that COVID, became a household word, and Trump was being impeached for the first time. And Vindman looked at that and said, why is Robert C. O'Brien using government money to visit the leaders of the Mormon church at Brigham Young University? I think that Vindman actually just didn't understand the nature of the relationship between the Mormon church and the military industrial complex. And he flagged something that was actually appropriate, like quote unquote appropriate for all parties involved. But then O'Brien retaliated against Vindman. And so that gave Vindman the opportunity to file this OIG report and get sort of like, because he wasn't getting promoted, right? And he wasn't getting the raises that he wanted or whatever. People can go read the report for themselves. So, but I mean, this connection between like prominent Mormons in high level national security positions, military industrial complex, so on and so forth. I mean, that goes all the way through Trump. And I haven't looked at Biden's administration at all, but I would imagine if you looked, you would probably find many prominent Mormons still involved in that Biden administration as well, right?
I have said myself, and I found it interesting that you brought up Trump. I don't know if I can't put my finger on exactly why, but I always get like a certain vibe with like Trump, Mormons, and even Musk, like somehow kind of intertwining with like a certain vision or idea.
Yeah, well, it's funny that you bring up Musk, right? Because, I mean, are you guys aware that I'll never remember his name. It's Jared something. But did you guys know that Elon Musk's number 2 man is a Mormon? Are you guys aware of that?
No.
Yeah, so it's Jared Birchall, I think, but if I get that wrong, people are going to kill me. But so his number 2 guy, if you just Google Jared Birchall, Elon Musk, you'll see that he's been managing Musk's fortune, which is really fascinating because if you go back in time, you'll see that Howard Hughes was also handled by the Mormons and their intelligence group, to the point where that term Mormon Mafia that you'll sometimes hear really stems from a guy by the name of Gay. His last name is Gay, and I can't remember I think it's Robert Gay, but I can't remember his first name right now. And out in LA, they took Howard Hughes and they just kept isolating him and isolating him and isolating him. And then when Howard Hughes died, a check showed up on Spencer W. Kimball's desk saying, this is Howard Hughes' fortune. He wanted to give it to the Mormon church. Oh. And eventually they like that ended up being like a forgery and a problem. And the church didn't take that money or anything like that. But what you can see is that like some of the richest men are really handled by Mormons, right? And like, look, I can't prove that Jared, whatever his name is, Birchall, is Central Intelligence Agency. I've never seen any evidence to that. But what you can see is that he is in charge of Elon Musk's financial empire and in charge of multiple companies that really he has no business running, right? And so it gives off the same appearance as the Howard Hughes situation back whenever that was going on in the 50s and 60s, right? And then, of course, if you want to chase that down even a little bit further, that the guy, we would call him Brother Gay or Elder Gay, like he ties directly into Mitt Romney. So Mitt Romney shut down Bain Capital because Gay's daughter had gone missing. And so, you get Romney involved at this point. And like I said, I mean, they're all connected and we could go down a million different rabbit holes, but I just want to be careful not to do that sort of in the format that we're in. So, but it's all very, very, very much tied together through the familial relationships and the occult secret society relationships.
It just always struck me odd, but when I went into Mexico, and then of course, when I was in South America, that the little bit of the history that I knew about South America, especially with the dirty wars of Argentina, that how I believe that was when the Mormons really stepped up their game and their presence in Argentina and their missionary. What's it called?
Uruguay. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then you started
Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil. Mm-hmm.
You started to see all of this unrest in these countries.
Don't you also have?
Wasn't, but
there's also Nazi presence in some of those countries a long time ago as well.
Well, and I have a question about that when we get to the Rotary, about the Rotary, Nazis, Jews, and Mormonism. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so let's. I mean, I think this is actually a good time. Let's just keep talking about this because I think it's fascinating, and it's okay if we don't get to the rest of the chronology. But like, let's talk about this because again, just last week, somebody sent me a document, another CIA document, which I did not put in this timeline, but it shows the quote unquote Mormon people asking the CIA for access to IBM equipment, which at that time was really deeply tied into Nazi Germany, right?
Correct.
There weren't a ton of people who knew how to use that equipment, and there certainly weren't a lot of people who could afford to purchase that equipment or utilize it. And so this is something that's really fresh and really new in my own research, and so I can't speak like really intelligently to it. But actually, in that link that you sent me today, no, you know what it is? It's the Kuhn and Loeb connection. So Kuhn and Loeb is German families, right, that came over to America, and then they're financing a lot of different nations, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right on. Like, and I don't want to try to go too deep because I'm going to sound really ignorant because this is a very new area of research for me. But those ties are real, and I mean it's been known for quite a while. Like a lot of ex-Mormons and anti-Mormons will use the Nazi Germany's treatment of the Mormons as an example of like why you shouldn't trust Mormons, because Mormonism was one of the few religions that was sort of allowed to sort of just go on with business throughout the time that the Nazi socialists were in charge over there. And so I think it's definitely something that you could go way, way deeper than I ever have in terms of that unrest. I do want to speak to Eastern European unrest, though. It sounds like you know more about sort of that Latin American unrest. What you'll see is that men like Russell M. Nelson and the Special Affairs Committee are going into countries in Eastern Europe and giving quote unquote humanitarian checks when something like an earthquake happens in Armenia, right? And there's a really good book called Mormon Missionaries Enter Eastern Europe. And I'll never forget when I read this for the first time because it just became so clear to me what was really happening over there. So what had happened is there would be a natural disaster. And the Special Affairs Committee would send somebody like Russell M. Nelson over there to give them a small humanitarian aid check. And that would get them in the door, right? Once they had their foot in the door, then you would have Nelson saying, well, you know what you guys need is you guys need like a concrete factory to rebuild all of the buildings that were damaged in the earthquake. And I just so happen to know a guy named John Huntsman, right? Well, Huntsman is Sigma Chi, right? So Huntsman comes in and he gets these huge contracts to build these things. Then you have them saying, well, look, if we're going to be building these concrete factories, we really need a place to house them. I know a guy named Bill Marriott, right? So then Marriott, who's Sigma Chi in Washington, D.C., gets contracts to build housing for the people who are building the concrete factory. Then you have them come in and you say, well, look, if we're going to bring all these people, we need to feed them. I just know a guy named Don Staley, right? Don Staley was like the president of American Grain or something like that. I can't remember the name of the company. But like what you just said, it's just a patronage network, right? And you started off with a small humanitarian donation to somebody who has had a really horrific thing happen. And then eventually, especially in Eastern Europe, and again, this is very hypothetical and I don't have any documents to back this up, but with what we know with the church working with the CIA and what the CIA was doing in Eastern Europe, I don't think it's too much of a leap to understand that the church and the CIA had a common goal. They both needed to get into Eastern Europe. The Mormon church needed to get in there to preach the gospel. The CIA needed to get in there to establish democracy. And it was sort of a marriage made in heaven, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like it's too much of a leap, really, to me. At least, you know.
And it sounds very Red Cross-ish.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all these service organizations, right? If you look at sort of LDS philanthropy, and this is a good place to tie it back into Rotary, right? and I didn't pull most of these documents into the timeline, but if people just Google Mormon and Rotary International, you're going to see dozens and dozens and dozens of articles about the church donating to Rotary and Rotary giving awards to Mormons and Mormons serving as presidents of Rotary International and so on and so forth. And it's all under this guise of service organizations. But when you look at Rotary International's own documentation, it's very clear that what they're aiming at is sort of this one world situation, one world. I mean, like, look, I don't want to get too much into it because it's too new to me, but if you're going to be promoting the United Nations, and if you look at what the United Nations is doing, it seems pretty clear to me that they're pushing for a one world religion, one world government situation, right? Mm-hmm. And so where Mormons really became aware of this was with the COVID situation, right? And that's sort of at the bottom of my thing here. And it really threw a lot of people for a huge loop when the Mormon prophet, who was a doctor, came out and started telling people to get vaccinated, which of course was deeply tied in with like Rotary and the United Nations and those kinds of things. Yes. And for the first time in generations, I think people really had to stop and wonder what the agenda of the church's leadership was. And what I think we've established here in the last couple of weeks is that the church's mission and agenda is far more closely tied to Rotary International and the United Nations agenda and mission than it ever is or was to do with anything that, like, Joseph Smith, for example, envisioned for his religion, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so it's, to me, it's a sort of an open shut case at this point, like, because I've been in the documents, and it's like, we're not here just throwing out rumors. Like, everything that I put on my timelines is tied directly back to a primary source that we found in something like the CIA Reading Room or newspapers.com or a school yearbook. And so I have this saying, right, where anybody can say anything, but actions reveal intent. And Mormon church leaders say really wonderful things, right? Really beautiful things. But when you actually go and identify what their actions have been since their college days moving forward, it's a totally different picture than what you would expect to see from the leader of a global Christian religion, right? It really is more of a business financed by now probably worldwide financiers, but originally by East Coast financiers that then made a lot of promises to the military industrial complex and participated in a lot of really nasty things on the personal level with things like MK Ultra, and on the global level with the toppling of governments potentially, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of the overall working hypothesis right now. You know?
Well, when you said something about how, like, some of these secret societies are basically shame bonding, we covered Synanon last week, and how there was that whole shame bonding, and we kind of tied it into the beginnings of MK Ultra, and that in and of itself the beginnings of MK Ultra out of Harvard with Henry Murray saw a lot of that shame bonding or shame kind of bringing it to the surface of that. But what I was going to say, the toppling of governments with all that didn't you have some of the Rotary members contributing not only to IBM, which was the first punch card that the Nazis used, but Cyclone B, which was the gas that was used to actually exterminate in these concentration camps. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it was when Nick said that you were coming on, I was like, oh, I'm going to start looking up some things. That I read that at some point, I think the Rotary Club was banned by the Third Reich because a majority of the members were of Jewish descent. But in order to gain survival, some of these Jewish members pledge allegiance to Nazis or were Nazi sympathizers. And so that's where you see some of these IBM, Cyclone B, being provided as a way to, and again, I may have gotten that completely confused, but I believe at least that it came out of people who were active members of Rotary International at the time. Yeah,
no, I wish I was a little bit more like knowledgeable about this, Lisa, but like, I mean, literally it was last week that I sort of got clued in, and I've really been looking at the Mormon connections to it. I haven't even really had a chance to dig into that other side of it. But I think that if people are interested in this, I mean, really, truly, and honestly, like, it was the easiest dig I ever did to connect Rotary to Mormonism, and then like sort of watch it branch out into these things that you're talking about a little bit, right? Yeah. And I just haven't had time to sort of take my shovel and just keep digging, as far as I need to. But one of the really interesting things too was like the number of people that sort of appeared on my Twitter timeline once I started, once I acknowledged this as a thing, like the number of like sources and hints that stepped forward to give me documents and so on and so forth just sort of exploded to the point where I'm so far behind here. And so I think it's going to take sort of a larger community, especially because my specialty is really abuse in the LDS church. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think that like there may be some ties in terms of like, I would imagine that like you can find some abuse scandals that involve, well, no, in fact, I don't think, let me give you an example. Last year, Chelsea Goodrich stepped forward and Michael Resendez, I believe, wrote a story about how the Mormon church tried to pay off a girl who we know was tied to Mormon apostles like David B. Haight. And her dad, John Goodrich, I want to say, was the president of Rotary in his local area. He was a dentist and he was president of Rotary. And he was also a prominent Mormon who abused his daughter for a very long time. And when she stepped forward, a guy by the name of Ridding got involved, and he's tied into the bottom of my chronology here too, because there's a really terrible ritual abuse case in Utah right now. It's the Hamblin case that involves David Hamblin and David Levitt. But Ridding was working for the church as their risk management lawyer, and Chelsea Goodrich taped him trying to talk her into like a really low settlement, and then she refused that, and then they gave her a really big settlement because it was a really big thing. But that was one of the first things I found when I started looking for ties between Rotary and Mormonism, is that in this abuse case, this guy that was abusing was the president of Rotary International, major donor, extremely influential person, which gave him a ton of protection when the allegations started coming forward inside of the church. And the church has system upon system that is built, at least in my opinion, to protect abusers at the expense of victims. And so it's amazing the scope of how this goes from the personal, right, to these men abusing people and then covering up, to the global, which you've brought up multiple times here, and rightly so, of like toppling governments. I mean, it's really kind of overwhelming to think about the implications of the oaths that these men make to each other in order to push forward their agenda and their mission, right?
Right. I think so.
Yeah. Do we still have time? I think we're probably going a little bit.
No, you can go. If you don't mind, you can go. You can keep going.
Yeah, I think I do. I want to show you, we talked about Mount Olympus, right? The home of the East Bench gods there in Utah. And I want to show you something that we really just very recently dug up that's really pretty profound. And I have a whole nother timeline attached to it. I'm not going to show you that timeline, but I just want to talk about what happened here. So these people that I have a picture of that will blow up here now, this is Dick and Brenda Miles. So Brenda Miles is the daughter of Russell M. Nelson, the Skull and Bones prophet, right, that we talked about earlier. And in 1985, Brenda and Dick Miles were allegedly involved in a pedophile ring in a town called Bountiful, Utah, that's just north of Salt Lake City. So the Paper Dolls story talks about several abusers in that book. And one of those abusers was a man by the name of Bill Karstensen. And Dick and Brenda Miles, when the allegations came out in 1985, were tied to Bill Karstensen. Bill Karstensen is a diagnosed pedophile who ended up committing suicide in 1995. So what happened when these allegations came out is Russell M. Nelson had been made an apostle of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1984. And so about a year after he was put into sort of that top tier of leadership in the Mormon Church, these allegations against his daughter surfaced of child sex abuse. So within the last month or two, I had a source step forward by the name of David Hardy. And David Hardy hand-delivered abuse cover-up instructions to Russell Marion Nelson at the church office building that were given to him by his brother, Ralph Hardy Jr., who is one of the Washington elite Mormons that we talked about earlier. So this is where you can sort of start to see everything sort of gel together, right? And how all these sort of things that we've talked about up to this point contribute to, like, at least in this level in Utah, something so like a really bad miscarriage of justice, because they were able to bury that story in 1986. But then what ended up happening is, I'm sure you guys have both heard of the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping. The man who committed that crime was named Brian David Mitchell, who was also a part of the Paper Dolls book. So he's one of the abusers in the 1960s that went to Skyline High School and East High School that didn't get punished back in the 1960s because the Mormon Church didn't want to address it. Then there was a third case, and that's the Casey Woody case. And a man named David Fuller lured a girl online to meet him and took her to a storage unit and sexually abused her and murdered her. He is also a part of the Paper Dolls book and one of the men that was abusing in Mount Olympus in the 1960s that was never properly addressed and grew up to murder this girl. So you have three boys from the 1960s and like sort of late 1960s at Skyline High School and East High School in the Mount Olympus area who were abusing, we don't know how many victims yet, but went on to murder, kidnap, and establish a pedophile ring in Bountiful where we know there were at least dozens of victims. That was then covered up by a Mormon apostle who received abuse cover-up instructions from the hands of a special affairs committee lawyer based out of Washington, D.C., right?
Oh my God.
So there's one more thing that we just uncovered last week that makes it even worse. So when we were going through the court paperwork, so what happens is this gets buried in 1986 and it goes away for quite a long time. But in 2018, David Hardy teams up with a lawyer that I'm not going to name here. People can see it. It's on my website. But they round up some of these victims and they file a lawsuit against Dick and Brenda Miles in federal court. And I was able to get my hands on those court documents. And as we read Exhibit 9, that is the declaration of Mother 2 in the court papers. And as we started tying the pieces together, what we realized is that the mother in Exhibit 9 is the mother of a guy named Justin Huiman. And Justin Huiman disappeared in 2017 from Utah. He had a really troubled life. He was addicted to painkillers and some other things. But the reason that he had a really difficult life is that he was a victim of Bill Carstensen after the 1986 cover-up of the pedophilia ring in Bountiful at the hands of Russell M. Nelson. In the papers, he's not named, but you can find interviews with this mother and the sisters, and it's really clear that it's the same family. And so in 2017, Justin Huiman goes missing and is presumed at this point dead, as far as we know. The only reason that this happened is because they covered up the abuse in 1986, and the mother, who was a church office employee, married Bill Carstensen because he wasn't punished for what he had done in 1985, because Russell M. Nelson covered up that abuse. And so Justin was born to this woman and Bill Carstensen, who he then went on to abuse, which led to this 2017 disappearance. It's an active case in Utah. You can Google his name, but he is presumed dead at this point, from what I understand. So you can sort of see, you know, the seeds get planted in the 1960s with the church being involved with these occult organizations that make agreements and oaths to protect each other at any cost. They want to protect the assets and image of the church at any cost. They don't take care of the problem in the 1960s. And by 2017, you've got a disappeared individual in Utah who's presumed dead because of the abuse he suffered because of the cover-up in 1986, right?
Yeah.
So the year after that, the man who did the covering up in 1986 and who hired a Skull and Bones lawyer, well, wait, I shouldn't say it that way, because we don't know who hired the Skull and Bones lawyer. But in 2018, when the case was brought against Dick and Brenda Miles, a Skull and Bones lawyer by the name of Jim Jardine was hired and brought in to kill the Brenda Miles case. And they did a really brilliant thing to do that. I'm not going to cover it. People can go to my website and read about this, or go to Twitter and just search for Jim Jardine on my feed. But they did this really brilliant thing, but it required Jim Jardine to lie in his briefing to the Utah Supreme Court. where he talks about cases being dismissed because of the therapist's involvement and satanic panic and implanted memories and all the baloney that you hear from the CIA people whenever ritual abuse happens, in order to draw attention away from like the fact that people need surgery to repair the damage done to them and put the focus on Satan and implanted memories, right? But a year after Justin disappears is when Russell M. Nelson, pictured here peering into a hat like Joseph Smith did when he was translating the Book of Mormon, was installed as the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on the 17th of January in 2018.
17.
Yep. And so, yeah, and he's the 17th president of the church, which I don't think means anything. I know the number 17, especially with like Trump people and the QAnon and all that kind of stuff, or Q, excuse me. He's the 17th president of the church. So that case does end up getting tossed. The Dick and Brenda Miles case gets tossed on procedural grounds, okay? Not on the merits and not based on the evidence, but because Jim Jardine goes into the Utah Supreme Court, which you have to kind of wonder how Jim got access to the Utah Supreme Court in another case where oral arguments had already been heard. But when you understand that he's a Skull and Bones member, it helps you understand why maybe he was able to access the judicial system in the way that he was able to. It also helps you understand why maybe the people who ruled on the case that he said was overturned didn't check his footnotes and call him out like every other lawyer would have been called out in that case, right? But in the end, it doesn't matter. The case is killed, and the statute of limitations, which was extended for sexual abuse victims in Utah by the legislature, was deemed unconstitutional in Utah. And so there's a whole class of Utah sexual abuse victims who don't have the right to pursue justice in their cases because of the machinations of Russell M. Nelson, Skull and Bones, Jim Jardine, Skull and Bones, and who else, who knows who else was involved in this, getting this case killed. So to go back to sort of the Rotary International and United Nations sort of flavor of things, one of the first things that Russell M. Nelson does when he becomes the prophet of the Mormon Church and the president of the Corporation Soul there in Utah is that he calls two new apostles, one who's affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations, and one, when you start looking into this Rotary Mormonism connection, you'll often see that Ulysses Suarez is the Mormon representative whenever they're talking to Rotary International, right? And so you can see, again, sort of the fruits of Marion Clavar Nelson back in 44 being Rotary International president, and then his son becoming the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And immediately he starts to internationalize the church in sort of this United Nations way by calling these apostles that have ties to some rather sketchy organizations, in my opinion. And then Garrett Gong actually has even worse connections to this Hamblin case that I'm going to cover here really soon. But I'm gonna sort of plow through this because I know we're over time. But like,
no, you're fine. You're fine.
Again, that people really like. So we talked about the schism that happened at the very beginning of this. There was another really major schism that happened in the church during COVID, right? And I mean, that happened all across the world, but in the church, there was a really major schism because when COVID hit, these Mormon leaders came out, like, not just sort of like suggesting, but like trying to use their moral authority to guilt people into getting the vaccine, right? And I don't have a position on the vaccine. My position on the vaccine has always been that if you prayed about getting the vaccine and you feel like God told you to get the vaccine, then by all means go get the vaccine. But if you prayed about it and you felt like you shouldn't, then like just don't get it, and everybody just leave each other alone, right? So it's not so much like their position that bothers me, but like you have Russell M. Nelson coming out and calling that vaccine, which we now know is not a vaccine because the Ninth Circuit ruled on that last week. But you have the prophet of the Mormon Church using his moral authority to say, look, in order to be quote unquote good global citizens, you need to take this vaccine because it's a quote unquote literal godsend, right? And so like what I've started saying is like, I mean, it was a literal godsend in the sense that it was literally sending people to God, right? And we continue to get more and more evidence of that, in my opinion. And there's a lot of room for debate here. And like, I don't know where you guys stand on this, but in the church, it caused a major like awakening of like, who are these people and why are they trying to tell me to inject things into my body? Like, they're here to give me religious guidance, not medical advice. right?
I totally
Bingo.
totally agree with that. They shouldn't even be having an opinion on it.
Yeah.
That's just
So a
my
lot
thing.
of people really stepped away from the church at that point and have never come back. And a lot of people are still kind of at church, but they're very upset about what happened there. But I think it makes a lot more sense when you understand that his dad was the Rotary International, and their sort of position on vaccinations and that kind of thing, and like in their philanthropic work and that sort of thing. I think this all sort of neatly falls in place when you understand that Russell M. Nelson is sort of the tail end of the internationalization of the church, right? Along the same lines as the way that Rotary International wants the United Nations to succeed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the last couple things here I'm just going to point out is that, and it's only in this order because of the chronology, but in 2022, something really, really strange happened that's going to be a major problem for the church moving forward, probably. And you had this really weird press conference where David Levitt, who's a Mormon, came out and announced that he's not a cannibal, right? Well, nobody had accused him of being a cannibal, but when you get up and you're like the Utah County attorney and you say, I'm not a cannibal, like that gets people's attention. And that led to a grandma request, which led to a ton of documents being dumped about this ritual abuse case in Utah County that involves this man, David Hamblin, who was a therapist, and this man, David Levitt, and a ton of these other Mormon aristocratic families that are very well attested to in the fraternities and church leadership and so on and so forth. And so I'm not going to go terribly deep on this, but the thing to understand is that, like, so that Apostle Garrett Gong that got called in 2018, his family is attested to in the victim statements of the Hamblin case. And a man that's very, very important, his name is Gordon Bowen, is very well attested to in those victim statements. And it turns out that Gordon Bowen has had a 40-plus year relationship with Mormon prophets and apostles, but he's also a multiple times credibly accused, well, maybe I can't say credibly accused for the lawyers, definitely in court documents has been accused of child sexual abuse in multiple court cases. He's also the guy who was in charge of the Membership Has Its Privileges American Express marketing campaign, who later went on to own his own marketing firm, and just extremely powerful man. And so despite his behavior and the allegations that are really, I think I feel comfortable saying, like, the allegations are very well substantiated, right? And he's been able to wiggle out of the charges because of the power and influence, partly of the Mormon prophets and apostles that he affiliates with. But for those who are interested in this, I would highly encourage you to look at the work of Lynn Packer on YouTube around Gordon Bowen. And then on my website, I have all the court documents regarding his alleged abuse, of his children during his marriage to a woman named Barbara Timothy. So this leads straight to the doorstep of the church office building, because all of these men have been affiliating with, supporting, and protecting Gordon Bowen for 40 plus years. And so one of my major goals is to just continue to bring to the world the knowledge that the church that claims to have a zero tolerance for abuse has been affiliating with, supporting, and protecting child abusers, alleged child abusers, sorry. Like, when it's on video, I have to be a lot more careful about what I say. Alleged child abusers for decades. And these are abusers of the worst kind. And so I don't care what people want to do. Like, they can affiliate with and support whoever they want to, but I want them to have the facts about this. And I think the facts show that the Mormon leadership is, on both a personal level and a global level, a very dangerous organization to affiliate with right now. And it doesn't mean anything about their truth claims, but it just means that the people governing the institution right now, their actions show a willingness to hide things and protect people that really shouldn't be protected, and try to influence things that really aren't within their sphere of influence to be involved in.
Yeah.
So the last thing I have is just looking forward, because a lot of people have been saying, well, Russell M. Nelson is 100 years old, right? He's going to die. What are you going to talk about when Russell M. Nelson dies? Well, so the thing is it's not just Russell M. Nelson, right? So the next person on deck is
it's like Soros.
Alan H. Oakes. And Dallin H. Oaks has his own backstory that I'm not going to cover here, but you can see that during COVID, he did a Facebook post, and this was him with his new wife, his second wife, eating with gold-plated silverware on gold-plated plates with a picture of their family saying, during COVID-19, we take the government's, warning seriously, and so this is how we're celebrating Thanksgiving. And it just so happens that Dallin H. Oaks was part of a group called the Goldbrickers. And the Goldbrickers is sort of like fraternity light. It's Brigham Young University's fraternity, where they paddle each other in and sort of do some of the same things. But I would say it's not nearly on the level of like a Skull and Bones or anything like that. But Dallin H. Oaks is the one who was on the board for Union Pacific. He was the one who was in charge of Brigham Young University when they were using electroshock therapy to try to convert homosexual people to straight people. So he's got plenty of stuff to talk about too. And the more we look at it, the more that we see that, like, Russell M. Nelson is a really easy target, but in the end, we're going to have decades and decades of things to talk about, because all the men in Mormon leadership at this point have made these sort of compromises in their lives with their actions, which I think make it really questionable, like what their motives are and what their goals and what their real mission is, right? To me, it really appears that they're more a business that is deeply, deeply involved with the military-industrial complex than they are anything to do with a religion, a Christian religion, trying to convert people to become disciples of Jesus Christ. And so that's sort of where I'll leave it. I'll let you guys ask any other questions you want to.
I have just a comment in terms of COVID and Mormons as well as Rotary. I believe some of these clubs, whether it's Lions Club, Rotary Club, secret societies, what have you, I believe that they are somewhat tense to capture people, and that we look at the high-ranking level people and we think, oh, they're in charge, but actually they are first in line to be the actual puppet on the strings. Because if you look at, and we won't get into it here, but if you look at the everything that went down with polio and all the controversy with that and some of the malpractices with that, and then you see who is one of the largest donors to the Polio Vaccine International, it was a Rotary Club. It was near $1 billion back in the early 80s. And so you're like, that doesn't make any sense. And in terms of all that, then you see how it played into the whole COVID thing. They were gonna, because they had done it with polio. I don't know.
Sure.
The track record, it tracks, right? The track record
Sure.
is there, that they basically are given orders and they do as they're told, and then the people then instruct their people to follow suit.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think, like I said, I work in data all day long. And so my job is to really identify patterns in data and then use those patterns to try to help people make better decisions.
Right.
And I could be wrong and I could be right, but I think what you just outlined is very clearly the pattern that they, right? Like all, like it's the people in the military, it's the people in government, it's the people in the medical establishment, it's the people in law, it's the people now we know in these churches.
Right.
And that pattern that you just laid out, I think to me is very, very clearly the pattern when you look in the historical record. Like, we live in 2024 and most people don't make decisions based on going back and looking at historical documents. They see something on a Twitter feed and they have an emotional reaction, and they have a tribe that protects them and provides for sort of their basic needs. And they're going to fight to the death to keep a roof over their head and food on their table, right, and whatever positions of power, influence, and gain that they have. But when you stop and you don't let Twitter or Facebook or whatever other, maybe even YouTube shows dictate your decision making, and you take the time to go back and look, the pattern that you laid out, to me, seems to be, I mean, I don't know how you can argue against it from a logical and rational position personally. Right.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah. Have you ever wondered if maybe it started to become like an intelligent operation?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, look, I mean, like, so my church has it's called the Strengthening the Church Members Committee. And that entire committee is strictly there to gather intelligence on people who are problematic to the church's mission and goals, right? And so, and like, when you see that 1984 document, and look, so let's just talk about the name of that, of the Special Affairs Committee, okay? So do you know who else has a Special Affairs Committee? Scientology does, right? Do you know who else? If you go find a lexicon of like how they use words, uses that word special in a very special way. It's the Central Intelligence Agency.
Yeah.
So when you see the CIA using the word special over and over again, and then you see it start showing up in churches, again, like I don't have a document that says, hi, my name is Joe Mormon, and we're going to spin up a committee, and we're going to call it Special Affairs Committee because you guys call your stuff Special Affairs. But like, if we can rub two brain cells together for a little bit, I think we can probably draw the conclusion that when you see special affairs, it probably has to do with intelligence gathering.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
I really believe what we're witnessing is the death of what I call cosplay Christianity and public relations religiosity. Right? Like, and it's not just Mormons. I think it's basically every major church that you could name just got sucked into this thing. It was their times. And they got sucked into this idea that they could pretend to be Christians and get up on Sundays and give wonderful sermons that say all the right things. And then Monday through Saturday could go and meet with the director of national affairs and plot about how to overthrow Russia, right? Communist Russia. And somehow they justified that in their minds. And then, like that document shows, the 1984 document shows, there's a part of them that realized that if people found out what they were doing, there was going to be a problem. And so they had to spin up public relations arms, right, in order to fight and like make sure that they correlated everything and were programming you with what they wanted you to believe about what it is that they were doing. And so like in the Mormon church, this is unbelievably clear. I haven't looked at it in other, but they have correlation committees that got spun up. And they literally were just whitewashing things out of history, right? Like the 1977 Kimball Khashoggi meeting, for example. Right. Yeah. But that's all about. And again, like the thing that's really concerning is when you look at the CIA's mission, what were they trying to do? They were trying to control the media arm in order to program you to tell you what it is that you ought to believe about whatever it is that they felt was important so that you would contribute to whatever cause they thought was important, which for better or worse, like, I mean, clearly they were just scared to death of communism. Right. And probably rightfully so. Like, I don't want to live in a communist nation personally. Like, that's just me, right? But like, it doesn't justify the behavior. It doesn't justify the means that they used to accomplish their purposes, especially when you're at church, right?
Right.
So yeah.
It seems like all these tenets, regardless if it's Christianity, Islam, Judaism, what have you, it's all of them are competing factions with each other. Almost like if you were to look at the cartel factions in Mexico, how they're competing with each other and competing for almost to be the next darling for the intelligence agency, so that they get picked as potentially the outcompeting religion for the one world religion, and that they get crowned to be there and to be at the top. But if you even go back further, and I've kind of seen this better now that you've been researching with Nick, is that all of it kind of stems from the Third Reich, and it stems from this world religion type, the outcompeting each other to be the darling of these offices of special affairs.
It would be really fascinating to drive that all the way back, wouldn't it? And just see like if there is that root, right? And I mean, like as a researcher, that's always the temptation is like, where did this start, right? But I think that's certainly like, I mean, I know these guys on Twitter, they're really pointing towards Racine, and they point back to Nazi Germany, right? That's, I mean, they said that's the whole thing there, right? And I don't know a lot about that. And so, but I mean, I think it is I'm like this little small Mormonism part of it, but because it is so small, the patterns are accentuated. And I'm wondering if people take the same patterns that we observed in Mormonisms and just try to apply those patterns across other organizations, if they're going to find that it ties directly back to what you're saying there. I think it's a beautiful point.
Well, you know what? I just want to add this real quick, and this is probably like a really good example for a lot of times when I try to explain why I think Nazi could be occultism and magic. You know how you said before the special affairs could be like a group of people kind of making them, I guess, making the Mormons believe that they're doing whatever they're doing, even though it's not true. Like, that's even part of their job, is even like bullshitting them about like what they're there for. I would say it's like the same shit really with Nazi magic, is that they're actually giving you a false reality that you're believing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a touchy situation, our subject, but like if you look at the Mormon temple, okay, like as somebody who went through that situation, without divulging what I think is probably like inappropriate for me to divulge, here's what I'll say about a Mormon temple. It's a temperature controlled, dimly lit TV program that you're supposed to watch over and over, in which you are put into a position of mild to moderate to, for some people, really serious anxiety. Like there was a whole thing that we didn't even talk about today called the Pace Memo, where the presiding bishop of the church was investigating Satanism and ritual abuse, not satanic ritual abuse, Satanism and ritual abuse inside the church on behalf of church leadership. And what was happening is people were going to the temple and they were having flashbacks about abuse that had occurred, because in that temple, you're in a dimly lit, temperature controlled, it's a TV screen, you watch a movie over and over again, you're put into a state of anxiety, and then you're asked to make promises to people, right? And so, like, is that what the Mormon temple was intended to be? Or is that what the Mormon temple became once the Mormon leadership got deeply tied in with the military-industrial complex and groups like the CIA, who have been proven to be shown, like, to try to control how you think and feel by putting you in dimly lit, temperature-controlled rooms with TVs and making you watch things over and over, inducing a state of anxiety, and then asking you to make promises. Like, it's not like apples to oranges, right?
Yeah.
So that's really touchy. And I know, like, that's going to upset a lot of Mormon people. Like, if you have a better argument, come with it. I bet Nick and Lisa will talk to you, right? But like, when I look at it, and I went to the temple a lot. Like, I was a temple attending member for a long time. And I personally it wasn't really an enjoyable experience for me. There were parts of it that I enjoyed, but like overall, I didn't enjoy this sort of anxiety inducing, temperature controlled, pummel me with the same message over and over again, and then ask me to make promises about like what I'm going to do with my time, talents, and energy, right? Like it never felt quite right to me. And at least for Justin, I think I understand why it didn't feel quite right now. I don't think that's ever what it was really intended to be. I think it's more a product of the reality of who these leaders are and who they've been working with than it is anything to do with Mormonism per se. But I could be wrong about that too. Who knows?
It sounded like a perfect marry between the book of 1984 and Joseph Goebbels. I don't know why, but that just kind of came to mind.
Yeah, 1984. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, it's crazy that CIA document is from 1984,
yeah,
right?
I was thinking that before. I was like, wow, what a year.
Yeah, there's a lot of those things. I mean, there's like, that's where you put your tinfoil hat. Like I like my tinfoil hat, right? Like, so like, I love putting my tinfoil hat on and like pointing those things out. But in the end, like, it's about chronology, right? It's about things that happened in time and space that we can validate and verify. But we know that these occult societies love their symbolism, right? Like that's not a secret. That's not the secret part of the secret societies. They're very proud of their symbolism. In fact, there's a picture I would love to show you guys. I don't have it pulled up, but there's a picture in the newspaper provided to this newspaper by the University of Utah Skull and Bones Society. And it is so chock full of symbolism that it would make your head spin, right? And so they love that. And so like, I don't think there's anything wrong with like, it's a puzzle, right? And they think they're the elites because they understand the puzzle. I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to like solve the puzzle ourselves, right? And figure out what they're up to, you know? I was going to say something about what Lisa said earlier too. You have to remember Joseph Smith Joseph Smith ran for president of the United States of America. So when you talk about these competing cartels, I think that's a really beautiful analogy. And it's like, as I've talked to lawyers who are involved with like LDS whistleblowers and abuse cases, that's sort of how they talk about it is, look, you just have to look at it as like, they have common purpose, but they also have competing interests. And so what you'll see is just like in the mob, like if you stay on your territory, everything's going to be okay. But if you step over the line, there's going to be a war. And that's actually like the way that I look at that Paper Dolls book is that if you look at the families that were involved in that, it was a Mormon aristocracy family that had children that were abused. And he was a Skull and Bones member. And when he went to go get help, what he found out was that he was up against an even more powerful part of that Skull and Bones group named Russell Marion Nelson. And so he was expecting to get help, I think. And instead he got squashed. It just ended up in a situation where it really was people with common interests, but competing interests because of the abuse that took place. And there was sort of this family warfare going on in Bountiful, Utah. Right. So I think that's really a great analogy.
You know, one thing I did want to ask, not to kind of like get off topic, but it's just a question that I have you ever noticed anything with like Mormonism and being big with like the Boy Scouts?
Oh, jeez. So
it's going to be for a totally different reason why you think I'm asking, but
okay. Well, yeah. So I mean, so Boy Scouts, yes. So Mormons and Boy Scouts are like peanut butter and jelly, right? Oh wow. Okay. Like Mormons really funded the Boy Scouts. Like it's like, and when they pulled out of that organization, that's when you saw the Boy Scouts go bankrupt. And so in addition to that, because I'm in the abuse space, I mean, the Mormon Church has over 2,000 known cases of abuse in that organization, right? That's just the ones that we know about, right? Now, I debated a guy that wanted to he wanted to argue that, that Mormon Boy Scout troops were 6 times safer than any other Boy Scout troop out there. But when you go and look at the data that he was using, what you find out is that an entire decade of documents, which just happens to be the 1980s, disappeared from those Boy Scout files at the time that the church was deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched in the leadership of Boy Scouts of America, right? So, yeah. So, I mean, I'm interested to know, like, sort of where you're taking it. But, yeah, I mean, the Mormon church, like, they were the tail wagging the Boy Scout dog. So let me give you an example of that. So the Boy Scouts of America had a video on sexual abuse that every troop had to watch every year in order to protect the boys and make sure that they knew how to fight back, right? I can't remember what it was, like 3 Ps or 3 Rs. I think it was 3 Rs: report, resist, something else. So every Boy Scout troop had to watch that, except for the Mormon troops, because when they brought that video to the Mormon troops, the Mormons said, no, this has to do with sex. And because we're a religion, we teach our children about these matters, and we're not going to watch your video on sexual abuse. And so they had their own training that they did, which I was a Boy Scout in the church. I can tell you, I never had any training about how to resist a predator when I was a Boy Scout in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, ever, But they were so powerful that they were able to sort of wag the dog when they wanted to, in terms of like running those troops the way that they wanted to. So major. And like Thomas S. Monson, which was another Mormon prophet, you can find a really kind of scary-ish video on YouTube where they did a big scouting event at the Tabernacle there, or the event center. I can't remember what it's called now. The convention center, not convention center. It used to be the Tabernacle, and then they built the big one across the street from it, and I can't remember what it's called right now. But they did a big scouting thing where they give Thomas S. Monson one of their Silver Beaver Awards or whatever it is, right? Like one of the biggest awards in scouting. Well, I mean, and look, like you watch that video, it's a little bit frightening. And so then what I saw just last week is somebody on Twitter put up this thing about like how Rockefeller was supposedly funding Boy Scouts of America in order to get boys used to taking orders. And I don't know whether that's true or not, right? I haven't had time to dig on that. But certainly when you want to tie it back to sort of that Third Reich idea, like the closest thing in America that you have to sort of that organizational structure is Boy Scouts of America, right? Where you put a bunch of boys in a troop and you put an authority figure over them and you tell them, like, you have to do exactly what we say whenever we say it, right? So I don't know if that's sort of where you're headed with that.
I had 2 reasons why. One of them was going to be because of the connection to the brown shirts, which is basically what you're getting into now. So I do find that interesting. But when I was covering the Smiley Face Killers, and I ended up going down like that Rotary Lions Club and looking at like police department people. I ended up at a I think it was it was a Boy Scouts, where like somebody from one of those things was like linked as they were linked like on the business as like an associate. And there was like 60 associates or something like that. It was crazy. There was a ridiculous amount of people attached to this one Boy Scouts out in, damn it. Was that out in Austin or no? Yeah. Wow. And it was like really weird because like most of them were, that's right. It was a lot of energy people. And you had a lot of that out there. It was tons of energy people, and then you got like lawyers, and then judges, a few judges, but it was like a huge amount was energy people. But like the whole thing is like now thinking about like how the Rotary Club was like thrown in this mix. I never thought of looking for Mormons, so like I'm wondering, like, was I looking at Mormons on that list when I was looking at
potentially.
Yeah,
yeah,
like was there a connection there? I had no
Mormons.
idea.
One thing Mormons are great at is keeping records, right? So like,
yes, they are.
When you're looking for Mormons, like it's like finding those ties really aren't that difficult because like they keep incredible records, right? And so it's not too hard to tie pieces together like that. It'd be really interesting to go back and take a look because, I mean, so definitely. I mean, Rotary, the little bit that I know about Rotary, it really fascinates me. So I was doing just sort of my shallow dig, right, where I go to newspapers.com and I just type in Rotary International, I choose Salt Lake City, and I just read everything I can for a night. And one of the things that fascinates me about Rotary is this idea that they're going to take one person from each area of business in their community, and they're going to form a club, and they're going to agree to do business with each other, right, at the exclusion of everybody else in the city. Like when I read that, it really boggles my mind that in America, where we call ourselves a capitalist society, where we believe in free markets and the ability of people to do business with everybody, why you would be forming secret clubs, not really secret, but clubs of people where you're going to limit the number of people that you're going to do business with to consolidate wealth,
yes,
to consolidate influence.
right.
And then also, look, the less people who know what's going on with you, the better the chance you have of pulling it off, right? Exactly. So if you're the steel guy in Utah, or let's use Nelson. Nelson was an advertising guy who employed all kinds of nasty people, right? We're finding. So, but he was in advertising, and he became president of Rotary International in 1943, 1944, as the war was coming on. What do you think that the government needed Rotary International to do to the population in 1943 and 44? They needed them to be advertising to get people excited about sending their kids off to get mowed down across the pond in war, right? So like when you have a society like that, like, I mean, and look, again, like I love the symbolism of Rotary, like the gear, that's beautiful. Like what is a rotor? It powers everything. And then you hook up one to another gear and another gear and another gear, and all of a sudden all the gears are turning together. And if you think of Rotary in that framework, like in Utah, it didn't take 10 years to have 30, 40, whatever it was, Rotary clubs all over that state, all working towards a single goal and doing business with each other, consolidating wealth, consolidating power, consolidating influence, right?
Do you ever wonder if some of those are just shell companies?
Oh, sure. Well, look, I mean, again, so like, let's go back to Watergate, right? Like we know that Mullen advertising agency that Bennett had bought was a CIA cutout, right? And so, yeah, no, I'm 1,000% sure of that. I mean, and we're getting a little bit sort of deeper into it, but like, if you look at Maricopa County in Arizona, right, and the Mormon influence there, that all started with insurance, the insurance industry, right? And there were 6 or 7, I can't remember, really prominent insurance executives that were all Mormon, who then took their experience and farmed out into the major insurance companies across the nation and the world, right? And so, like, yeah, I have zero. Well, I mean, like, look, the Mormon Church has been caught with their pants down on the Ensign Peak scandal. I don't know if you guys know about that, but where they, were having people sign the back page of a SEC document without ever seeing the numbers that were attached to it. They were using shell companies in that sort of in that scandal, which was illegal, right? The SEC filed a lawsuit against them, which was settled, right? So a lot of my Mormon friends will say, oh, it wasn't even illegal what they were doing. Well, yes, it was illegal. They were setting up shell companies using the names of people that were normal names that nobody would look into, that weren't attached to the church. And then they were having those people sign documents without ever looking at those documents and just put their signature on them. So like, is the church involved in all kinds of financial stuff? Yeah. And the key person there, I'll tell you right now, is M. Russell Ballard, who just died like a couple of years ago. So, and then like we're getting like a lot deeper at this point, but like the thing about M. Russell Ballard is that he was the primary point of contact for Gordon Bowen, right? The sexual abuser, Gordon Bowen, the alleged sexual abuser, Gordon Bowen. And he was also we know that he was interacting with Tim Ballard, right? So M. Russell Ballard was the one giving special priesthood blessings to Tim Ballard, allegedly, right? And I have sort of a weird theory about this that I don't know that other people share with me, but I actually think that M. Russell Ballard was sent to gatekeep Tim Ballard, because if Tim Ballard was allowed to do what he was doing in Utah, it was going to lead straight to Gordon Bowen and M. Russell Ballard in the church office building, right? And so I think they actually sent the special affairs group, sent him to corral Tim and say, hey, what if we gave you money to go to Haiti? What if we gave you money to go to Mazatlan? Hey, what if we gave you some ketamine treatments? What if we gave you, and I think Tim got himself upside down personally. And I mean, there's a lot of like speculation there. Like I'm more than happy to like address, like, or not address, but I'm more than happy to acknowledge that. But like when I just look at sort of the overall patterns and then I see what happened to Tim Ballard, and I've reached out to Tim multiple times through intermediaries and directly and said, Tim, if you'll just tell the truth about what M. Russell Ballard was doing with you, I bet people would have a lot more sympathy for what happened there, because I think you just got turned upside down by a guy who couldn't let you do what you wanted to do in your home state because it was going to lead straight to his front doorstep. Because M. Russell Ballard, guess where he lived in Utah in the 1950s and 1960s when that abuse was going on? Mount Olympus, Utah is where Ballard lived.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
So, like I said, I mean, it's all, and like I could spend days and days drawing connections for you guys. It's a small enough world that once you sort of identify the family names and start just kind of keeping your eyes open,
Yeah.
you know, you sort of see it's all tied together.
I would agree with that.
It's a wild spider web.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So really, it's been interesting. I started out to try to help individuals who had been abused and were having trouble with the church. And I ended up finding CIA documents and ties to Rotary International and so on. It's like, it's been a wild 18 months, right? Like not at all what I intended to do at all.
That's wild, yeah.
I wanted to write a little booklet to help people that had been abused in the church and were having troubles dealing with the church, because I was a ward clerk. So I knew all the policies and procedures of the church. And I just wanted to tell people this is how it should go. And this is what you're going to confront when you go to try to get help. And all of a sudden I found myself in this like really weird world of CIA and Rotary International and child sex abuse and Satanism and like all kinds of stuff that I didn't intend to ever really be talking about.
It's a really weird connection.
Yeah.
You know, the other connection that, and it's just me personally, that you always see, and I know I said this already, but you always see a strong Mormon, what do you call it, when they go out to these countries. Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. And when you look up Rotary International, you see a lot of, you know, black and brown babies. And that's the same thing with, you know, the whole some of these.
Oh, so you're talking about the adoptions. The adoptions.
No, when they do some of these, what did you call it?
Like it's, missions or outreaches and stuff like that.
Missions. So yeah, so missions.
And you see this almost obsession, and I don't know if it's more of a picture thing, like an advertisement, but I see it because I'm Hispanic. You see it continuously. You see it with Mormonism. You see it with missionaries. You see it with cults. You see it with the UN. And it's this obsession of concentrating their efforts with black and brown people. It just seems very, very odd to me. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, like in the church, they had the Indian placement program. I don't know if you guys have ever heard about that, right? But a lot of abuse happened inside of that. Well, I shouldn't say that. Like, I shouldn't say that declaratively. We are beginning to learn about the scope and nature of the abuse that happened inside of the Indian placement program, and it's sort of that impulse to what, civilize, I guess, is like how they viewed it, right? And in the church's place, Christianize, right? This entire group of people that they thought they knew the history of, right? Which is really sort of a funny, fascinating story, because now there's like Indian chiefs who are coming out on YouTube and saying, look, we have our records. Don't tell us what our records say. Like, you don't know who we are. You don't know where we came from, right? We've kept our records. And so like, yeah, I mean, it is an interesting impulse, right? Sort of like that manifest destiny, you know, / colonization / you know, civilizing the, whatever you want to call it, right? That we all learned
the natives
in high school, right?
Right.
Junior. So yeah, definitely a strange impulse. But I mean, obviously I think I mean, in 2024, that's not flying anymore, is it? I don't know.
No, I don't think so.
I think people have had it.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. Yeah.
So,
but
this is definitely a topic that piqued my interest and something I'm sure I'll eventually look into myself as well. This is really interesting. Thank you.
Absolutely. Again. Yeah. I mean, any questions you guys have, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to provide documents. And like, I work with a ton of people at this point, and just what I'm really here to do is just help people put things in time and space. Right. And once we put things in time and space, we don't have to argue as much, because things get pretty clear pretty fast. You know
what? Another thing, have you ever noticed the Lions Club at all?
So it's really interesting, because I've heard you guys mention it multiple times, and I have an email that came in last week that said, don't just get stuck on Rotary, look into Lions, and this guy gave me a list of 5 or 6 of these sort of social clubs, right? And I mean, I think just overall, I think all of these, anytime that you go to a place where you're going to pay money, right, and you're going to make some kind of a promise to some group of people to exclude others, you're probably looking at something that is going to lead to some bad outcomes eventually, right? Like, I just don't really see the point, right? Like, what's the point of that? I don't know. And so, like, I think, especially when you get into these places where the surface mission, like where there's like an underlying current of what they're actually doing versus what it is that they're saying, which again, like, I just love saying this. I'm going to say it like 1,000,000 times before I'm dead, but like, anybody can say anything, right? But action reveals intent. So like, when we stop paying attention to like what Rotary Club says that they're doing, and we just look in the newspaper and we look at what they're actually doing, or we stop looking at General Conference in the Mormon Church and what they say that they're doing, and we look at what they've actually done, man, like, my life got so much easier when I just stopped listening to what people were like. Well, you don't stop listening. You listen very carefully, and then you go and you try to validate or falsify what they're saying, right? And it's okay to take a position. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're trying to verify or falsify. Like, if you have integrity and you do the dig, like, you're going to come out one way or the other, verifying or falsifying what you were told. The problem is people just, like, they'll take whatever is said to them and they'll just take it as gospel truth without ever even engaging this part of themselves.
Right.
Very well said. Very well said. Very well said. And to be honest, that was a really well put together presentation. I was not expecting something that, I guess, professional. So
thorough.
Thank you. Yeah,
Very thorough. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Have you been on any other? Have you gone on podcasts before?
A couple others, but it's this is by far the most calm I've ever been. Congratulations, guys! You kept me in my cage. That was good. So I did a debate with a guy named Jacob Hansen, who's a member of the church. You can find that on YouTube. That was a debate on whether or not the church protects abusers, and I got pretty worked up in that debate. And then I was also on with a Catholic guy on Twitter that invited me, as I was in the process of getting excommunicated. He invited me to come on and talk, and so I did 2 shows with him. Also, pretty worked up. Like, this is as much for my as it is for anybody else's, right? There's a lot of selfishness in what I do. I'm not going to lie about that.
Oh, I get that. I understand that to an extent, for sure. You know, I like to cover things that interest me. I mean, I guess that's selfish, right? But, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, again, thank you. I mean, like I said, that was, like Lisa actually said, thorough, I think you said. Yeah, it was very thorough. I was very impressed. You brought, like, receipts, visuals. I appreciate that. So yeah,
absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me
and
on.
Let everybody know where they can find your your blog or whatever. Plug that, and I'll put the links for that the show for when it comes out too.
Yeah, super easy to find. So it's just LDSabuse.info. And I mean, like, as a human being, I'm easy to find. Like, if anybody wants to talk, like, my phone number is on my website, right? And my email address is justin.riggs@ldsabuse.info. And I'm happy to take documents from anybody. I'm happy to talk to anybody who's struggled with abuse of any kind. I do focus on LDS, but if anybody wants to talk, they're free to reach out. And I always say on Twitter, I'm easy to find. So let me just say this is the fun part for me. For those people who run the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who refuse to talk to me, I am easy to find. Reach out and let's chat about this and see what we can do to let the world like understand what happened here. So, but anybody who wants to talk to me can find me. I'm really easy to find.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah, again, I really do appreciate that. Yeah, actually, you went into a lot more than I even expected you to. So,
yeah.
And
well,
one
the
of the
thing is, there's probably hours and hours more we could talk about, and that's what's it's just
sure.
it's really it's unbelievable.
And even the stuff you sent me earlier, that was your site, right? Those couple of things you were sending me earlier in Twitter.
I honestly don't remember, but probably.
Yeah, I think it was yours, and that was pretty interesting stuff. So, like, I definitely suggest
we've
people
got a
go
whole
check out your
library of
thing.
CIA documents, right? We've got a whole library of court documents of abuse cases. We've got a whole library. Just stay away from the blog because that's me just ranting and raving like a crazy man. So just stay away from the blog, right?
You sent me some stuff, and I was like, wow, this is a pretty interesting read right here. So yeah, his link is in the bottom. And thank you again last time. And Lisa, thank you very much for jumping on. Yes, and asking questions when I had none to ask, because like I said, to be honest with you, this is all very new for me. You know,
yeah.
So.
We'll reach out again. We're happy to talk again.
Yes, please. Yeah, I definitely. If I saw it, like I said, I'm probably gonna look into this. Any new stuff I find, man, that's of interest, I'll definitely toss you away. So I'm sure you'll be hearing from me. And if you ever come into any new stuff that you want to share, you're always welcome back on. So just reach out. So same for you.
Wonderful.
And
thank you so much, guys.
Of course. And that is the end of another Occult Rejects. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.